In Nietzsche's Gay Science, written in 1882, he proclaims, "God is dead, God remains dead." Now, over 100 years later, I say, no, to our arrogant proto-redditor Nietzsche, it is science that is dead, and God has once again prevailed. This does not mean that progress is dead or the explanation of all emergent processes, but instead the idea that science or causal determinism is the end of metaphysics. Since the inception of modernity, our time has been defined by the rise of the causal deterministic worldview, which until now has existed alongside all prior wisdom in an ever-rising tension, in which we now find ourselves at its climax. This has been the ultimate conflict of modernity, in which all else has been but a manifestation of this ultimate ideological battle. It has been said over and over by these modernists since Newton and the Enlightenment that it's only a matter of time until religion dies and science prevails. This notion has sat in an almost uncomfortable unacknowledgement by the religious, as their family and friends quietly scorn their primitive worldviews. One individual cannot possibly know all there was to know about physics, chemistry, and biology, and thus any opinion on the totality of science was inherently ignorant and invalid, insofar as it was not the opinion that causal deterministic science would one day explain all of reality. After all, to the adherents of scientism, it was clear that in a few centuries, a few decades, or a few years, that the ever-increasing technological and scientific advancements would one day stomp out the last of the believers. This concept is perfectly summarized in the New Atheist God of the Gaps argument, which relies on the idea that there is no limit to knowledge, as all things could of course be explained eventually through causal determinism. As long as we had the initial state, we could predict its future. The funny thing is, by the end of the Enlightenment, the full implications of this modernist worldview had already essentially been fully thought out. This resulted in David Hume proclaiming that causality is an illusion, so even the empiricists eventually had to admit that the hope of infinite human knowledge was deeply wrong. Kant famously clarifies this point by adding that causality is a structure of the mind, not a true feature of the external world. Therefore, it is something that we impose on the world. It is our way of making sense of reality. After all, we never had full evidence of causality. The closer we look, the more uncertain things become. For example, when you hold a piece of chocolate in your hand and allow it to melt, you know that the melted piece of chocolate is a direct continuation of the solid piece. You think this despite not having knowledge of every single literal molecule in the chocolate and the causal process in which each of its constituent parts change into the melted piece. But obviously, you don't need this knowledge to make the conclusion that it is the same piece of chocolate. You therefore make an assumption. It was then clear to Hume that we just grow accustomed to certain results through growing acquainted with them through experience. The debating empiricists and rationalists, which had been at odds since the origins of human thought, had therefore both concluded causal determinism was illusionary, long before the physical evidence introduced by the quantum revolution. One of the most apparently negative manifestations of this worldview is the outright disregard and rejection of all things non-modern, regardless of its content. It is truly ironic, for just as the moderns accuse Christianity of disregarding all non-Christian thought, the moderns cast to a T the exact willingly ignorant judgment of knowledge that they describe. It is hard to find a case of such a thing in Christianity, which has since its inception incorporated various intellectual traditions, such as the classical tradition and the scientific revolution. Modernity knows it would not withstand the same arena of ideas, and so it must reject it and not reconcile with it. So ubiquitous is the idea that moderns are enlightened and all past people is ignorant than was ever present in the Christians throughout history, at least from an intellectual perspective. It is the most stunning and egregious contradiction, and the refusal to look deeper defines the struggle of our time. It's much easier to not think deeply and trust the ruling scientism bureaucracy and its vague dogma for those same moderns who accuse Christianity of doing the same thing. As Plato, Aristotle, Hume, Kant, and Descartes discovered for themselves the theoretical limits of knowledge, it's no surprise that the very physical discovery of this ultimate boundary does not faze the moderns. As of course, they reject all prior knowledge, for we have smartphones now, but this is why science is dead, and we killed it. At the end of the 1800s, there remained several mysteries that seemed fundamentally unexplainable in classical physics. These were the cracks in classical physics that would eventually lead to its unraveling, particularly the ultraviolet catastrophe, highlighted and encapsulated a major flaw in the classical worldview. Essentially, the assumption that wavelengths of light existed as a continuous phenomenon led to the wrong prediction that a black body would emit infinite spectral radiance at higher wavelengths. The problem was solved by Max Planck, who instead posited that that electromagnetic radiation existed in discrete quanta. Einstein later showed that this was a real phenomenon with real particles called photons. This discovery marked the beginning of the end of classical physics and showed that the universe was not infinitely divisible, which in turn led to the discovery of objective indeterminacy shown by thinkers like Born and Heisenberg. This led to the introduction of probability, and thus had been shown the fundamental boundary to knowledge. The reality of indeterminacy was not accepted easily, however, and thinkers like Einstein and Schrödinger greatly protested, pointing out the wild metaphysical implications of such a thing. Einstein said, "God doesn't play dice." Einstein, just because you can't understand which way the dice will roll, doesn't mean he doesn't, who is infinite and outside of space and time. If anything, it makes sense that there is a boundary of understanding. Did he expect to be able to explain all the way to God himself? This is why thinkers like Einstein and Spinoza did not believe in free will. It did not fit in their causal determinist worldviews. Fast forward to the modern day, and things like entanglement have been experimentally proven. And now classical causal deterministic physics is a distant memory of the scientifically optimistic past. Aristotle has some apologizing to do to Plato. It seems the debate has been settled. The world just now needs to catch up. The implications of this are of course huge. Metaphysics has been found to not be fundamentally reducible to physics, and therefore transcendence was back on the table. If there is a fundamental wall of causal knowledge, not only from a perceptual perspective, but from an objective material perspective, then what can possibly lie on the other side? Such a thing is of course fundamentally unknowable. And of course, what else fits the bill of being fundamentally non-understandable and all-encompassing, yet transcending, than the monotheistic God? Doesn't it make more sense that such a force should influence the world in a way which is in its very nature not traceable, such as the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics? This is not a proof because, as Kant says, it will always be fundamentally impossible for us to prove the existence of God or comprehend such a thing in any meaningful way. But, of course, it reopens the door for essentially all of the world's religions, which start from the previously unproven premise that there is meaning, providence, and spirit in all things. We have fully killed the idea that there is a first cause, which can explain every decision we have made in our own lives. The implications for free will and individual responsibility follow strongly from this revelation. The opiate of the masses was never Christianity, with its highest degree of personal responsibility, but was instead always materialistic modernity, once again rearing its ugly head as it has for time immemorial, such as in the days of Epicurus. For what else has made the world content with wickedness in our time than materialistic modernism? So, finally, we are freed from the dogma that we have or eventually will find the answer to all life and evidence. The question is now back to you.